Welcome, everyone, to today's Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, brought to you by Still and Moving Center every Saturday. Our theme for the entire year is Citizens of the Future, for which that quote that Joan just read for us was selected as an overall quote for the year. And I love the part in it about temples made from hearts. In regard to today's topic, which is reverence. And we are very fortunate to have with us someone who is a steady and longtime participant in Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, Bob Buzz. He has worked as a religious studies professor, and he is also a practicing Zen Buddhist. Today, because he is that kind of expansive person that we can imagine us, ourselves and others as citizens of the future to be, he's going to speak to us a little bit more from the Christian tradition, since he's going to be focusing on Albert Schweitzer's Reverence for Life. And Bob has, in my estimation, shown so many of our conversations that kind of reverence for all life in every form that it comes in, that he does seem like a really appropriate person to speak with us on this subject. And I wouldn't be surprised if he sprinkles in a few other references for our edification. So, Bob, if this is a good time for you to start.
Well, thank you. I think this topic fits especially well with the idea of citizenship, but from a real focused perspective and very specific perspective. And when I saw that idea of reverence, I chose to think of it, again, in a very focused kind of way, the reverence for life that Albert Schweitzer talked about. So I think it'll come around to the larger idea of reverence, which is essentially, I think, spiritual. And it's certainly found in, when I think of religion, I think of really religious truth is a truth that is universal. So if it's not universal, well, I don't know if it means very much. And we will find, I think, some of that universal truth in the Christian thinkers I'm going to be looking at today and others. Albert Schweitzer was a very interesting historical character. He lived from 1875 to 1965. He was a medical doctor. He was a Protestant theologian, a Lutheran, a musician, a pianist, and a philosopher. He was born in between Gandhi, who was 6 years older, and Einstein, who was 4 years younger. So he's right in that period. He's not very much remembered today. Now, perhaps if he is remembered, he's remembered as a doctor going to Africa as a medical missionary and saving hundreds of lives by practicing medicine in the jungles of Africa. He was a famous thinker, and he could have lived very comfortably in Europe as a theologian or as a philosopher, and particularly as a pianist. He was a concert pianist, gave concerts around Europe, but he chose to dedicate his life to serving others in a very particular kind of way. And I think he, because of that, influences people, thousands of people, by his good example. As a philosopher, he doesn't ground his work as a philosopher normally does. So in some sense, I think he's an existentialist. It's just that the ground of existentialism for him is not the individual alienated in the world, which Renee and I were talking about existentialism a while back, and she was surprised when I talked about some of my favorite existentialists as Christian existentialists. Gabriel Marcel was Catholic, and his given, that which is given to existence for him, was the mystery of being, was creative fidelity. That's what was given, not necessarily the alienated individual, which is atheistic existentialism, of which we know a lot through Jean-Paul Sartre. Just as a curiosity, Jean-Paul Sartre is Albert Schweitzer's younger cousin. So, but I think really, in some ways, Albert Schweitzer is a true existentialist. He said, ethics is nothing more than reverence for life. And that's really the heart of his philosophy. And reverence is a very particular word. I think, at least when I hear it, if I don't think deeply about it, I think of it as the same as love. And that's certainly not incorrect, but I think it's love taken in a very particular way. And if you don't have additional aspects, then I don't think you have reverence, and I don't think you have love, either one. Those other elements are awe, a reverence for the sacred. Albert Schweitzer said, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. That's the given. That's our existential condition. And good consists in maintaining, assisting, and enhancing life. And to destroy or to harm or to hinder life is evil. Reverence is that feeling of respect, awe, admiration, appreciation for something or someone. And because of those things, it becomes holy or whole or healthy or sacred. In Christianity, reverence is the gift of the Holy Spirit. It's the highest form of love. And I'm just going to begin by giving some references of what I mean by love. Agape is the highest form of love in Christianity. There are three forms of love, typically. The first level, the lowest level of love, it truly is love, but it's the lowest level of love, is the erotic or the sensual. Certainly that's a connection and it's real. The second level is fidelity, a certain level of trust, but perhaps not complete. And that leads us to the third, which is agape, a true identification of the whole of love, where I and it are not separate, what Martin Buber called I, thou. And we see this a little bit. Fidelity would be maybe the love of friends. And it might lead to agape or that true identification, but maybe not. The love of a master for his disciple. Think of Jesus's 12 disciples. They truly loved the master, Jesus, but not completely. There's a famous story where there's a great storm and the disciples, at least some of them, are in a boat, and they're greatly fearing the thunder and lightning and the winds and the waves. And they're calling out to Jesus, and they hear Jesus's voice walking on the water. And they are mystified and awestruck. And Peter, of course, the number one guy to speak up, Peter says, Christ, can I come to you? And Jesus said, of course, come to me. And he steps out and he hears a clap of thunder and he falls in. He truly loved Jesus, but he wasn't able to take that step into completely trusting that his master had said, come. If you come, you can walk on the water. He wasn't quite able to reach that level. In religion, another tradition, the Jain tradition, talks about ahimsa. And I think this is very close to a reverence for life. It's the idea that life is sacred and should not be hurt. Complete nonviolence. And again, this really gets at Jesus's idea of all men are brothers. If you have done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. If you've gone to Africa and served people there, you are serving me. And the least of them, I think, is why he ended up in Africa. There were many doctors in Europe. There was no doctor in Africa. And so that was that part of it. Some of the other aspects of love that I think come to bear here, in Greek, there's a word called sophrosyne, and it means a balance, but a balance that is truly one of moderation, of the yin and the yang coming together, of true balance. And that leads to a companion word called eudaimonia, the flourishing life, well-being. It's oftentimes translated as happiness. So we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Aristotle's eudaimonia is happiness. All men seek happiness. But what they really seek is well-being or flourishing. And again, I think that really connects to this idea of the reverence for life. Abraham Maslow called it self-actualization. Thich Nhat Hanh called it interbeing. This is the Buddhist concept that all things are interconnected. They flow. We walk the path in a way that really connects us to the path. And this leads us to something we talked about several weeks ago on the Gaian consciousness. Gaia is the Greek goddess of the earth. In Latin, natura naturans, nature naturing. And that's Gaia, being Gaia. Einstein said, there are times when it is worth stepping back to listen to the music. And this is, I think, the heart of what Reverence for Life is about, the beauty and mystery of the cosmos. Most of us, when we think of nature and Christianity, think of that, I'm sorry, just not my favorite Bible verse, but the verse that said, I give you, in Genesis, I give you dominion. He's talking to Adam and Eve. I give you dominion over the creatures of the earth. You are their master and you will dominate over them. And I think that, unfortunately, is the only verse people tend to think of. Nature is there for us to dominate, to use, and indeed, Jesus can't come again until we use up all those resources. I think that's a very small sense in our heart of what reverence for life is. Saint Francis said, no, that's not what it means. It means we should serve and protect and nurture life. That's what God wants us to do. And he did that, of course, by connecting intimately with the earth. Brother Moon, Sister Sun, Brother Wolf. And we're going to come to that very quickly, of how the wolf is our brother. And St. Francis was very clear, the wolf has a soul. That alone would have got him burned at the stake if he didn't have so many he wasn't so popular that the Pope really couldn't put him to the stake. But it is not Christian doctrine typically that a wolf has a soul. But if you have a reverence for life, it does. And it's interesting that spirit, a spiritual understanding, the word spirit is very connected to respiration, to breath. In Latin, the word is spiritus, which means breath or a gust of wind. So the spiritual understanding is reverence and life. One of my favorite Bible verses in this connection is from the book of Psalms, Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell within. The earth is the Lord's. We must treat it as a sacred way, and not only us, but everything that dwells within it. I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about the sacred in nature connected to the sense of reverence. Thoreau said, pursue some path, however narrow and crooked, in which you can walk with love and reverence. Einstein said, you can't blame gravity for falling in love. Reverence implies a kind of humility in the face of both the performed and the profound and the everyday. To approach something reverently is to do so with a sense of awe and appreciation. Reverence does not belong to religion. It belongs to community, congregation, sangha, tribe, family, ohana. And that sense of civility is really what is at the heart of a good citizen, I think. Aldo Leopold in a Sand County Almanac talks about a land ethic, and it really is a reverence for life basis. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. Aldo Leopold also said, we need to think like a mountain. I gave you a passage there if you happen to read it. And he came to this idea of thinking like a mountain, which is really a source of ecosystems or ecology. Only a mountain has lived long enough to listen objectively to the howl of a wolf. And keep in mind, St. Francis said, the wolf is our brother, and the wolf has a soul. Aldo Leopold came to this when he was a young man, and he saw a wolf dying that had been shot. And of course, that was the typical way. A wolf is just something to shoot because then there are more deer, there are more of the wonderful little animals we love. A wolf is not cuddly, and so we sometimes fear it. But when Aldo Leopold saw the fierce green life dying in that wolf's eye, and when it was dying, it was alive. But when it was dead, it was just another thing. It was a corpse. And he said, neither the wolf nor the mountain deserve this. If we don't think like a mountain, if we don't care for the earth, we will have dust bowls and we'll have the kind of conditions we're faced with. So my final section is coming home to a bigger, deeper home that has to do with belonging, that comes from recovering your natural kinship with the wonder of the planet. And I originally thought this was going to be indigenous thinking, but it's really, I think, a little bigger than that. It's really religious in its basis. But I do have a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. Albert Schweitzer said, as we acquire more knowledge, things do not become more comprehensible. They become more mysterious. There's a pygmy legend, an African legend of the pygmy. Pygmies live in the deepest, darkest part of Africa and very remote from outsiders. They were almost legend. White men didn't even know if they existed. They lived so much in the dark forest. They say, the man killed a bird, and with the bird, the song, and with the song, himself. We're far away from the mechanistic modern, I think, therefore I am. I'll end by saying the reverence for life is really harmony, balance, and rhythm of life. The poet Rilke said, beneath you, breathe, you invisible poem, pure, continuous exchange, with all that is, flow and counterflow, where rhythmically I come to be. Got a lot more, and at the same time, I think it's probably very close to coming to our discussion. So I want to give some closing remarks. I'm very fond of a book by T.H. White called The Once and Future King. And in it, the wizard Merlin is teaching Arthur to be a good, well, eventually a good king, but certainly a good citizen. And he does a wonderful thing. He's Merlin, after all. So he changes Arthur into a falcon. And suddenly, Arthur's flying in the air, soaring, catching a bird. And he comes back and he says, wow, that was wonderful. That was amazing. And he says what he perceived. And then Merlin changes him into an ant. And suddenly he's this small little creature. The steps of people around him reverberate the whole earth around him. And he's experiencing that sense of smallness that an ant has. And he comes back and describes that. And then Merlin changes him into a badger who's digging into the earth to get food and being a badger. And he experiences that. Then he turns him into a wild goose who flies differently than a falcon. He soars, he glides, he goes thousands of miles in migration. And he comes back and he describes that. And finally, Merlin turns him into a carp in the castle moat. And he's swimming, swimming through the mud and water. He hears people talking about the king and hears from their point of view that, that the king would never hear, but a carp in the moat can hear it. And so that, I think, is wonderful because it stretched his mind and enlarged his perceptions. And that's, I think, what reverence for life is. The poet David Whyte said, "What you can plan is too small for you to live." Master Eckhart, and this is a Christian reference again, said, "The outward work can never be small if the inward one is great. And the outward work can never be great or good if the inward one is small or of little worth. The inward work includes in itself all size, all breadth, and all length." That's reverence. For the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. I'll end with a quote from St. John of the Cross. And St. John is an interesting figure. We don't usually think of him and nature. We think of him, if we think of him, usually as that famous saying of the dark night of the soul. And this quote talks about that darkness, that night, but it also talks about the flow of water, the flow of life, the reverence that is part of what he's experiencing when he experiences God. So this is St. John of the Cross. "How well I know the fountain's rushing flow, although by night. Its origin, since it has none, no one knows. But that all origin from it arose, although by night. This living fount, which is to me so dear, within the bread of life I see it clear, though it be night." So I think that's plenty to chew on, and I could go on. And maybe some of the other things I have will come out in questions. But I would welcome any response to this or additional ideas about reverence, and especially reverence for life.
That's, Bob, that was just so exquisite. It's almost as if you really need to write that into a paper. I don't know where it would be presented, but I think it would be really well received. It's just really so well formed, and just so many interlaced ideas and quotes. Oh, this did the heart a lot of good. Thank you so much. Did you, can I ask you, did you have any kind of niggling in the back of your mind questions that arose after you did all of this studying and thought?
Well, I think the question for me is really, this world right now is so divided, so polarized, so filled with what recently David Brooks called a kind of meanness. And it's there. It's in the newspapers. It's in the way in which we see the news on television. And yet, fundamentally, and that's why I said this is existential, this sense of reverence, if we connect to part of it, we're connected to all of it. And that's really, I think, why it's religious, but also what religion gives us. There's no parts. There's no separation. And that, I think, is as Robin Wall Kimmerer said, this will take us away from despair. And I think that's what, as citizens, that's what we need right now, because we do have a sense of despair and alienation. And I saw this as an antidote to that. If you give it a little, you've got a lot. And, we've just recently been talking about things like anxiety and depression and all of this. And yet these people are so full of life. But, when I talked about Robin Wall Kimmerer, I was struck by another energy involved with that. And this is by an Oglala Lokata chief, Luther Standing Bear. And he said, "The old Lakota were wise. He knew that man's heart away from nature becomes hard or small or hurting. He knew that lack of respect for growing, living things soon lead to a lack of respect for humans too." And that resonated with me in that sense.
Cliff, I see your hand up.
I also like to say, Bob, that was really wonderful to listen to. I really enjoyed the all of it. I was also struck by that article by David Brooks, "Why has America become so mean?" And there was one quote in there that really grabbed me, and it was something like, he said that if we don't transform our pain, we transmit it. I noticed that in Hawaii right now, we're in a lot of pain here because of the Lahaina, and there's a lot of blaming going on. And I think it has a lot of that has to do with the pain that we're experiencing, and we're not knowing how to grapple with the pain. So we push it out as meanness or anger and so forth. Anyways, I was kind of thinking that we human beings, in some sense, have lost our place in nature. And that movie a long time ago called Koyaanisqatsi, I think, was Life Out of Balance. And that human beings are living a life that's not in balance with nature or with themselves. So we don't know our proper place in the world. We're dispossessed, in a sense, from this world, instead of feeling unified with the world and with nature. And so I was kind of wondering if maybe you could say something about that in terms of reverence for life, because there is this ancient saying that human beings do have a place in nature. There's a saying that help nature and work on with her, and nature will regard thee as one of her creators and make obeisance. This idea that we really do have a place here, we just don't know what it is, as custodians, as in terms of husbandry. I mean, it seems like we're self-conscious beings amongst all these other creatures for a reason. We just don't know what it is. But I think this idea of reverence for life is a key to it. And I was just wondering if you could say something on that.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that, that's the heart of it. And part of it is language, to say we're part of nature. No, we are nature. And when we say we are nature, we're connected to every part of it. And so that's the sense that I think is missing by just holding a mirror up and saying, this is me reflecting the world that's out there. I think the heart of it is really something like that. Joanna Macy says, we have a longing for coming home to the sacredness of our belonging to the living body of earth and joy of serving that at every step. That's kind of it. That sense of place is really us accepting that reverence for life. And really, that's what I meant by saying reverence, I think, has that mix of harmony, rhythm, balance. That's our place. And so either we placed it in that regard. Koyaanisqatsi is a wonderful concept. I think it's Navajo or Hopi, but that out of balance means that, well, I think of it in Buddhist terms, dukkha is suffering. And the image of dukkha is a wheel that has these spokes, and one of the spokes is out of line. And so the wheel is going to go chunk, ka-chunk, and every time the chunk happens, we are hurt, we suffer. And the world can be perceived that way, but it also can be just perceived as it's moving, as it is. And that's kind of the difference. You know, we can't control the way the world moves, but we can always control our place in it, our sense, our reaction, our response to it. So we're in this place, but also what is our attitude? And I mean, reverence for life is an attitude, but it connects us to our place. That's why I love this topic. And it's why I, in a sense, limited it to the sense of reverence for life. But it's not a limit. I mean, we're alive in the midst of life. And that's us. That's our place. And if we don't acknowledge it, our heart becomes hard or small.
I'm wondering, this is really a question for everybody. How do you see it possible to have this reverence for life, even if we're not in what we think of as nature? You know, I think we have a view that we need to be under the stars, the sun, you know, have wind rustling through our hair and our feet on the grass or the sand, and then we're in nature. And so then we can have a reverence for it. And I'm wondering amongst the group, if you have ideas about how we can experience this reverence for nature, maybe in contexts that are other than outdoors, that still has a reality for us. So it can be more of a 24/7 experience. So that's open to the whole group.
Thank you, Bob. I'm in my little house, and it's different from being in an office or in a condo. But when you talk about the wind, I hear it. It's just all around me. It comes through my windows. It comes down the hallway, and it's very powerful. And it it's unseen, but it's felt. And I've always been taught that, you know, nature is, you can't change it. You have to honor it, you recognize it, and you flow with it. Otherwise, you're going to get battered. You're going to get thrown down. You're going to get not very pleasant things happen. And it also brings to mind that the indigenous peoples everywhere have a great reverence, a great respect for the land. You cannot put something into the land that is bad, because the land will give it back to you in a way that you don't expect. And all the stuff that modern industrial lives are doing. It's polluting our oceans, it's polluting our water sources, it's polluting our land, and it's quite a difference from how we should all respect life. Amen.
Definitely true. And it's interesting that St. John of the Cross and many Christians may find themselves locked away in a cell, imprisoned or anything like that. But life is still there, and the breath is still there, And Rilke said, sheer abundance of being floods my heart. And he doesn't have to be out in nature. It's easier to feel it. It's flooding in from nature, but it's always flooding in if we're alive. That reverence for life doesn't have to be outside in a beautiful thing. It can happen inside a city where there's not much life, maybe a couple plants going through the cracks of sidewalks. But life is not separate from us, no matter where we are and under what conditions. No matter how hooked up we are on a hospital bed, we still have that life, and that's superabundance flooding through us is an attitude I think that's there.
Yes, I think what's the challenge is that we're kind of stuck on nature is, forests and rivers and the earth that grows food and all. I have a friend, at least I think he's a good friend, who says everything in existence, everything in manifestation is nature. Now, to make it that point a little simple, is he would certainly, and I would agree, that nature includes things at the level of invisible forces, electricity, magnetism, the forces that work through the human body, so that if everything in manifestation constitutes nature, then obviously we are in nature and ignore that. And just so you can give an example of all the invisible ways in which we let ourselves get disturbed by anger or excess desire for something. So I think we have to make sense of that idea about where we are in nature. It's not just a question of being in physical nature, all around. So even like dreams or a wave of thoughts, they all go to, and that's really important, that our thoughts help create the manifest world that we live in and have to cope with. So that would be my suggestion, that we recognize that there are many dimensions and levels to nature, and it's great that if we have a beneficial physical nature nearby. Some would say, yeah, we're very fortunate that we live near the beach and we can go take a walk on the beach. But that may not be enough to address the disturbances or the confusions in our thought and feelings. So that's something to think about, I think.
Perhaps I've mentioned this in the past, and if you've heard it, forgive me for repeating myself. It just was it's a striking thing for me to see as a young adult, which was somebody who was already a kupuna at the time, a retired person. And I don't remember what his profession had been, but at any rate, he was the person who was in charge of being the caretaker of the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara as a physical structure. And I just remember him going to one of the doors inside this beautiful old Victorian house where the Institute of World Culture is located. And so he went to do some repair on one of these antique doorknobs and its workings. And he had a wooden toolbox. And in his wooden toolbox, he had his tools. I think they were in kind of an array of fabric with little pockets that rolled up inside the toolbox. And so he set his toolbox down on the floor, and then he took out the holder, the fabric holder for all his tools, and he spread all those out on the floor. And he took out the ones that he planned to use. And then he worked very carefully on this door. And there was such a kind of loving presence that he brought to this task. And then when he had completed his task, he very carefully put away all the tools that he had used and rolled up the little fabric bundle, put it back in the wooden toolbox, and took it to the place where it belonged. And something about that scene, watching that scene for me, really struck me with how very alive and real, in terms of almost like, when Bob was talking about the wolf having a soul, but, almost as if every single tool that he had and the door he was working on, the doorknob he was working with, had some sense of life to it that he was very respectful of and almost reverent toward. Like, he approached it as if, maybe he were a doctor who was going to be doing a procedure on a newborn baby or something. There would be that kind of sense of reverence for life in the way that he handled and approached these things that I, up to that time, would have considered to be inanimate objects. It was deeply striking to watch somebody interact with these quote unquote things as if they were more than things, as if they had a certain maybe depth of soul or something. I learned a lot just in that half hour or so that I watched that man. I don't think I've ever quite looked at, thought about things in the same way. And I probably have been much less likely in a fit of anger to slam a door after watching how he treated the door and the doorknob and all the tools it took to repair it. So I just wanted to share that experience of someone exemplifying, I think, a reverence for life, not necessarily out in what we call nature, but certainly there was a reverence for life in what he was doing.
There's a wonderful story from the Chuang-Tzu, a Taoist master, Chuang-Tzu, and the emperor asked him, "You are a famous wheelwright. You form the wheels. How do you do it?" And he said, "I can't teach it. I can't even teach it to my own son." And the emperor asked, "Why not?" He says, "Well, it's inexplainable. It's a feeling for the wood, the feeling for the tool. The tool fits my hand, and I if I do it too hard, I chip it away. If I do it too light, I don't make the mark. The right pressure is impossible to describe, but I feel it. I don't think about it. I feel it. That's why I think when Nagarjuna said, being inseparable from life itself, we are inseparable from life therefore we have to experience it in thanks. We can't experience it in emptiness and void and pure spirituality. We have to experience it in our hands and the things that we relate to, the dance floor.
Maybe that's part of the existentialism that you're pointing to.
Well, yeah, a profound existentialism to say we exist. Yay. Yes, yes, that's the sacred yes. So there's a koan that says, Master, yes. Be aware, yes. Don't be deceived by others. No, no.
Yes, I was going to sit out this gem until I happened to notice the email and then seeing that it was Bob giving the presentation. And I was deep in meditation as I listened to the presentation. And I would just like to reflect upon the experience that I had. It reminded me a bit of many years ago, I spent an afternoon, could have been 90 minutes or so, watching a spider spin its web as the sun was going down in Redondo Beach, California. And I watched this spider leap into these various points to connect these anchors, and then proceeded to started working her way through the circles. And I was experiencing those as the quotes that you were giving us, pulling all of these various points and anchors together into this beautiful web. And at which point then, when she had completed those circles, landed in the middle of the web and awaited the evening meal. And I had that sense of just being held in this web of the thoughts that you were eliciting. And a couple of the quotes really spoke to me, but early on in the presentation, you were referring to that connection of the word spirit and inspiration and breath. And I had a revelation or a deeper understanding that as we breathe in, what was separate from us is no longer. We have brought it in, and it is now us. And I think of that as becoming one, this state of oneness. And I had the feeling that that's what you were describing as this sense of unity or love or connectedness, was that this separation is now gone. And that is inspiration. We brought the spirit into us. I was particularly fond of the quote, you'll have to remind me, the pygmy one was awesome. There was another one, and it may have been Schweitzer, talking about not because I have my head buried in the sand, but because what the earth gives to me every day. Do you possibly have access to that quote?
I do. That was Robin Walls Kimmerer. And she was talking about that givenness, so in a sense, yeah, what you're talking about is unity, very much is that sense of, let's see how she describes it here. She says, I don't do it because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily. And I must return the gift. So it's like a breath given to us, but joy is given to us. Reverence is given to us, and we have to give it back. That's I think the key of even Albert Schweitzer. Why did he have to go to Africa? Well, because no one else was going to Africa. No other doctor was stepping forward in that way. And it's a small thing in the overall picture of things, but it inspires us. And he really said that reverence for life can only be communicated through example. I mean, his example, his life, and he won the Nobel Prize for Peace Prize in 1952, because people recognized, not because of what he did specifically, but what he did with his life. The gift he kept giving over and over again. Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it.
What I was reminded of is if you tune into the news or even in a discussion like this, you'll often hear about how awful the world is. And I think it is our task, as that poem suggests, is to tap into the joy. We can't possibly understand the significance of all of these things that we may be calling natural disasters. We cannot possibly comprehend how that fits into nature. But to be of good cheer and to constantly look for the good, I think is our duty as citizens of the future. Not because we have our head in the sand, but because the earth is giving us joy, and it is our job to give that back to one another. By the way, these spider, just to complete that story, after the spider sat in the center of the web and the first bug came along and offered itself as a dinner for the spider, she just gently reached out, kind of like a harpist or something, and she plucked various aspects of the web, which caused the web to vibrate and spin itself around that little fly or whatever it was and capture it there. And she just stayed at the center and waited. And her meal was sitting there waiting, cooking up perhaps, until the second bug came along and was captured. And she did the same thing. She plucked the webs, it spun itself into a little ball, locked itself down, and then she went over to the first one and she had her dinner and then went right back to the middle. And she was very conservative in that way, always waiting for that next meal to be at hand. And there was just some beautiful life lesson about conservancy or about sustainability, some beautiful lesson that she had to offer in that moment. So I felt very blessed, as I do for your participation and your offering for us this week. Thank you so much.
It's interesting. The word community is very related to the word communication and communion. And that was there in that web. You know, the community of life is also how we connect to it, how it communicates, how we get our messages from it. And that is a communion. We share the body that we are. And we suck the life out of it.
I'm doing virtual support, but I was listening in on this conversation, and I was pleasantly surprised about the connection to existentialism. I'm not super familiar with what we're speaking about, but I'm, as a person and a human, I'm very familiar with existentialism, and I wanted to come with just like another generation's point of view, because I think a lot of people my age are dealing with a lot of existentialism in terms of the world and everything that's going on right now. And just similar to David's point, something that was really illuminating to me was the other side of existentialism, where one side is fear and another side is hope, and excitement about the future. And I think that that's something that I'm learning to I'm not learning to experience, but something I have experienced recently. I think it's very easy to look at the world and its climate change issues and think that we don't have much time left. But another end of that, and I think the duality of that is the positive of like enjoying the now, enjoying what we have here. And I'm only beginning to dip my toe in the world of philosophy and theosophy, and I think that this is also the beginning of me being a long-standing GEMS member, which I'm really excited for. But it's just the other side of perspective, and I'm learning, through life experience that it's all about perspective. And I think some people really want to hone in on the fear and the sadness and the grief of life and the misery of the world, when in reality, like, there's always that duality of wonder and excitement and hope for the future that we just don't know. And so it kind of reminds me of this this meme that I doubt anyone will be will know about, but just it's like a guy looking out the window and saying, I have no control, and it's like all this dark and gloom, and then another guy on the other side of the bus who's looking out of the window and he's like, I have no control, and it's rainbows and clouds. And I think that's where I'm at in life. So thank you so much, Bob, for speaking, and thank you, Renee, for hosting. And I'm really blessed to learn from you all and your wisdom. So thank you.
You know, you're right about the attitude. You can wake up in the morning and say, good God, another day. Or you can wake up and say, good God, another day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all the times that I spent like feeling like, good God, oh God, another day. It's just, it's kind of a waste of an opportunity. And I'm seeing life in every day as just as an opportunity. Yeah, it may be raining, but somewhere there's a rainbow. So yeah, thank you.
And it's not about control. I think the reverence, really the heart of reverence is really mystery, the mysterious. It is a mystery. Life is a mystery. We don't know why we're alive. We don't know why we have awareness. That's a gift, and it's continually given, but you can't comprehend it. You can't control it. That's sort of the flip side of that whole thing. It can give you joy. It can also give you anxiety. It depends
Yeah.
how you want to take it.
Yeah. And I think
There are different
the
kinds
last
of
thing
existentialists.
the last thing I'll say, and then I'll go back to doing my job, is that I think that I'm also a part of a generation that has access to knowing so much. We have grown up with access to Google, to these smartphones, and we want to know. And I think a lot of where the existentialism comes from is not knowing and not being able to put a definite on really anything. And so, like, on one hand, it feels like, oh, there's so many options, there's so many religions, there's so many spiritualities. And I think like that has been my experience. It is just being overwhelmed by all the possibilities. But then on the other end, it's like, wow, there's so many options, just pick one. Just pick one that resonates with you. There's no one right, key, one right philosophy. I realize I've been spotlighting everyone else. I didn't spotlight myself, but thank you, Anna, for doing so. And yeah, great conversation. I'm looking forward to the next gyms.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we are a little bit past the top of the hour, and I hope, Bob, that you have been able to really fully embrace the gratitude that all of us who have spoken feel toward you for that just marvelous presentation, thought piece, heart piece, soul piece that you provided to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to tell you about the topics for the next 2 weeks. We have the language of the soul coming up, and that's for next week. And I feel as if Bob was just speaking that language, by the way. Maybe we'll just rerun the talk for next week. So that's what's happening on September 9th. And then the following week, I believe, is Dancing in the Rain. And I think that's something that citizens of the future are going to do a lot of. Dance in the rain.
What David said about the spider, I was thinking Merlin should have turned Arthur into a spider. That would, I mean, all the creatures, though, there's no end to what we can do with our imagination of thinking like a mountain, thinking how a wolf feels when it dies. Our imagination is just an incredibly wonderful, awe-inspiring tool.
Yes, I think so. I think one of the interesting questions in terms of this reverence for life is like, how do we have this reverence for all the big and little tiny things of nature, and see our proper custodial role, since we do have, I believe, added responsibility, given that we probably, I don't know if there are any other creatures, so to speak, on Earth that by ourselves are pretty much able to create a terrible mess of it all. I don't know that any other creature other than human beings can do that the way that we can. And yet, on the other hand, when we properly husband nature, when we are the good custodians, which many of the indigenous peoples know so well how to do, nature can just really flourish with abundance. And so how can we take that role and still see ourselves in a sisterly, brotherly role, like St. Francis talks about? There is a sense in which we have responsibility in a way that other creatures don't have. So it's kind of a
Other creatures are blessed because they're alive, but they don't have to think about it.
right?
But I think we have like a 1-2-3 punch. We're thinking about life, and then we're thinking about the connection, the family, the kinship. And then I think the third thing happens, and this is where it becomes Christian or Buddhist or whatever practice you have religiously. A calling comes, and you have to listen to that calling. I mean, all of the people that I've read as quotes that I admire so deeply felt that call. Albert Schweitzer felt the call to go to Africa as a doctor. Robin Wall Kimmerer felt the call to take her biological botanical knowledge and go to the sweetgrass and figure out why it wasn't growing well, why it wasn't flourishing. And she found that it wasn't flourishing not because people were using it too much, but because they weren't using it enough. The native peoples were, in using it, actually creating conditions for it to flourish. So the hundreds and longer years of the native relation to the grass was part of the cycle. That's the rhythm of life. And, her calling as a scientist was to participate in that. And the only way she could understand that was to then talk to the elders. And so I've given about 3 or 4 answers to your question. Talk to the elders, connect, feel the call, it's the call for you. I mean, it might be, only you can hear the call.
I have a question for Bob. Bob, generally, what do you do first thing in the morning? Like, is there something that, like a ritual that you have that gives you like a reverence for life? I know we take Tai Chi together sometimes. So I was wondering, what do you do first thing in the morning?
Yeah. I'm still a student. I'm still kind of learning. And so, I don't really have a ritual. And I know that what I used to do when I was working, just as an example, every day when I got up, I would I was working in Kaimuki. So I would go to Diamond Head and I'd walk up and down Diamond Head. It took 45 minutes, 20 minutes up, 15 minutes down. It wouldn't take that long. But when I was walking, I could think about the day. But I could also kind of receive the sunlight, the wind, and it was before all the tourists came and everything. And that was a good ritual for me. I'm retired now, so I usually get up and I have a drink of coffee. That's what connects me right now. My wife lovingly makes a cup of coffee and I enjoy it deeply. It's funny because, reverence is a lot of things. Sometimes you can think of it as awe or love, but also just appreciation. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Whatever you have that you can appreciate. Right now it's coffee in the morning, I guess, to answer your question specifically.
That's great. I'm a tea person, but coffee will do too.
Chocolate.
Another moment in today's gem that struck me as Renée was recounting her story about the person fixing the doorway was that I experienced Renee in a state of reverence. She was describing reverence in the state that she was in, observing what she was referring to as reverence. But what I experienced was Renee in that state of reverence for was it your grandfather or?
No, he was a fellow member of the Institute of World Culture who he was living in the house at the and as a caretaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I put into the
David,
chat.
I think that's profound because, you know, reverence for life really is being inside life. It's not being separate, you know. So once you're in it and you're feeling that, then you are expressing the reverence. You know, it's your expression of it when you're really connected. You're expressing it already. It's an inside story. And if you're not inside, you're outside. And if you're outside, you're separate. So it's close to that. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have, many times we go through things automatically. That's why I mentioned the cup of coffee, because you don't usually stop and appreciate the wonderfulness of that taste, that experience.
I think you just went full circle right back to the beginning of your talk, actually.
But the pygmy quote, fortunately, is very simple. It's just, the man killed the bird, and with the bird, the song, and with the song, himself.
So good.
It's just so profound and so simple.
I was thinking overwhelm of information that the younger generation is now, you know, and with this new leap into ChatGPT, just the whole exponential growth in terms of not just data, but now information and maybe even approaching wisdom. But the one quote, and this may have been the Schweitzer quote about how it doesn't get simpler, it doesn't get more understandable, it simply gets more mysterious the more we know.
I like what Einstein said about that. Is sometimes we just have to stop and listen to the music. And that's it too. That's the music, is that same sense of reverence, when you can hear the music. It's interesting that St. John of the Cross talked about the dark night of the soul, and I think there's an inherent negativity to our thinking about that dark night of the soul when we're really in the darkest part of the night and we feel so alone and so traumatized. But he's saying, you know, night is part of the reverence. And I'm, you know, thinking of the native Hawaiian, which darkness is the source of light. Po is in the Kumalipo, out of life comes out of darkness, out of the night. And that's, you know, that's another way to look at it. You know, to say, no, the source of the life is the darkness.
Yeah. I think Warner said something, and he may have borrowed this from Watts, that you can't create from something, you can only create from nothing. Otherwise, you're just manipulating and changing and evolving, but creation comes from nothing.
A very rich nothing.
Did we call? Yeah.
That gets into a whole, but it's ways of thought about what nothing is. We could start a whole new conversation on that. Well, that's
Well, that's what I was thinking about with religion being universal, because it could be Buddhist, but it could also be Taoist, and it could also be Christian. It's there in Christianity. I mean, you know, God moving over the face of the waters is an interesting process. And as I think it was one of the poems that I read, well, actually, it was from John of the Cross. It said, it has no origin, and from it all origins come forth. So God doesn't come from anything. God has always been, but out of God, everything comes. So it's an interesting, it's the nothingness and fullness are like in Taoism, the Tao, the Wu Qi, the great nothing, is also the ultimate, the great something. They're the same.
Hmm. Bob, have you run across the recognition sutras? I think it's 15th century.
Hmm.
Shamaraja.
I don't know.
I'll send you a link to that. It's along these lines about what awareness itself is, apart from all the things and no things. Separate from that is awareness, and that awareness is everything.
Well, and similarly, the idea of nature is never complete. It's always happening, but we complete. Reverence is a completion in a funny kind of way. It completes, it's whole, it's healthy, it's our soul expressing ourselves. There's a wonderful quote, and it sounds to me very religious, but it's by Wendell Berry, and it says, "It is only the Christ life, the life undying, given, received, again given, that completes our work." It's really full. It is only the Christ life, the life undying, given, received, again given, that completes our work. And if he wasn't a Christian, he wouldn't have to call it the Christ life. He could have called it something else, which doesn't matter. Yeah. It is, the Buddha Dharma, our true nature, or our soul, or whatever the term is unimportant. It's really interesting sometimes to look at a spider creating a web. And if the spider is experiencing the world kind of funny, and different conditions, but sometimes you see webs that just go crazy and they're unconnected to things. And that's still the spider spinning the web. It's just a crazy web. That's okay too. That's sometimes we wake up and weave a crazy web. That day is a crazy web.
It might be dependent on what kind of bug they just ate.
It might be that, yeah.
David, I'm so glad that you decided to join us. Wonderful to have you, and Bob, just a million thanks.
Yeah.